This video is part 2 of my cider making series. I actually thought this would be part 3. Part 1 was all of the initial fermentation. I thought part 2 was going to be racking and bottling the cider, and then part 3 was going to be this, which is where I'm going to attempt to make something like Marmite using the yeast residue from fermentation. So just the other day I racked the cider and set aside this, which is the lees, or the yeast residue. It's probably yeast and some apple solids in here actually. So I set this aside. Of course the cider now needs to sit and clear, but this part where we're going to try to make a yeast extract needs to happen sooner. So that's what we're doing today. So this has been settling for a couple of days since I racked the cider, and you can see it's very clearly separated into a sort of buff coloured yeast layer and a clearer layer on top, which is the last little bit of cider. I'm going to just take that off with a basting pipette. I don't think it would be a problem if we just included this in the whole thing, but we might as well start with mostly yeast. Since it has separated and it's been sitting in this container for a few days, there might be some kind of vinegary notes in this cider residue here, so we might as well take that off. Okay, that's as much as I intend to separate. So there we go. We've got a rather kind of solid looking sediment at the bottom, and then this stuff, which I won't throw away for just now. Okay, so what is Marmite, or what is yeast extract? I happen to like the off-brand versions of this myself, but this is yeast extract. So it is a syrupy, dark, deeply savoury, quite salty substance that's made from usually brewing yeast. The manufacturing process involves breaking down the yeast cells, so like cracking open the little cells of the yeast to get at all of the little delicious bits that are inside the cells. The process of doing that is sometimes a bit secret, so I think some versions of it are done using chemicals, and some versions are done by just cooking it for a long time to break down the yeast cells. I'm going to be going for the latter approach because I don't fancy doing this as a chemistry experiment. Interesting to note that the flavour differences, I was thinking about this the other day, the flavour differences between Marmite and Vegemite. Marmite in the UK I think is probably mostly made from the yeast residue from ales, porters, brown ale, stout, those sorts of things. Vegemite in Australia is probably made from yeast residue left over from lagers, and that might well account for a lot of the difference in the flavours. Anyway, what does it taste like? If you've never tasted this before, probably the best way to describe it is it just tastes like a stock cube, like a bouillon cube. There's a lot of glutamates in there, so it tastes very deeply savoury, umami, and actually yeast extract is a common ingredient in stock cubes. Anyway, we're just going to get on and try to make some yeast extract now. In addition to yeast, these yeast extracts typically contain vegetable and herb extracts as well. What kind of vegetables? Who can say? But I'm going to be using celery, a bit of red pepper, a bit of garlic, rosemary, parsley and bay leaves. This will inevitably be different to regular Marmite or regular yeast extract because this is cider yeast. So what this doesn't have is any bitterness from hops, because there's no hops in the cider making process. In commercial yeast extracts, it is sometimes necessary, I understand, to debitter the yeast before making the yeast extract. That won't be necessary here. But it also does mean that this will be kind of different because it's just starting from a different place. If you've seen other attempts to make yeast extracts, and the chances are if you have seen one of those on YouTube, it might be Barry Lewis, who made a very good video about making his own Marmite. He started with sourdough bread, which he soaked in water, and then used that to culture the yeast. I don't need to be doing any of this because I've got plenty of yeast already. The reason that recipe works is because the sourdough bread replicates some of the flavours that you would get from brewing beer. So sourdough, you get a fermented flavour. I think actually the recipe cut the bread into cubes and toasted it, so you get a kind of roasted flavour as well, somewhat replicating the flavour of roasted barley malt, which you get in beer. Anyway, I'll just crush that, I think. I don't even need to actually take the woody bit out of the rosemary because we're going to be filtering later on. But I will just crush these herbs a little bit just to make sure we get the flavour out of them. I don't think we'll have a problem with that because this is going to be cooked for 12 hours. So all of those bits go into the vessel for my slow cooker. It's actually a multi-cooker, but I'm going to be using it on slow cooker mode. The yeast, but I say yeast, but as I've already mentioned, this is probably yeast plus some apple solids that settled out from the cloudy apple juice the cider was made from. I'm going to add some water, partly to rinse out this container, but also this will need to be cooked with sufficient water to dilute and draw out all of those amino acids and things as the yeast cells break apart. So I'm using about 3 times as much water as I had yeast sludge. That looks about right. There will also be a tiny bit of salt, because I think probably the salt is an important component in the breakdown of the yeast cells. But since this obviously is going to be reduced and concentrated later on, I don't want to add too much salt, or else we will end up with something that is unbearably salty. Marmite is typically salty, but if I make this as salty as Marmite, when I concentrate it, it will just set into a block of salt. So anyway, that's about half a teaspoon of salt. I realise that measurement doesn't really matter because I haven't precisely measured any of the other things. Just give that a stir, make sure that salt is dispersed and dissolved. Should I add in this bit of cider? I think I probably won't add this because it does smell ever so slightly vinegary. So I think we'll just leave that. Alright, so that's going to go in there. And although I mainly use this as a pressure cooker, I'm today using it as a slow cooker, which is a function it does. So put it on stew, on the slow cook mode. The valve at the top is offset so that it won't pressure cook. I could try pressure cooking this. I did think about that, but I think the long slow cooking method is necessary to give the yeast a chance to break down. So away we go. That's initially 8 hours. I may cook it for longer. And yeah, I'm working on top of the washing machine here because that's a convenient flat surface out in the utility room. We're not about to use the washing machine today anyway, so that's just a convenient place. I want to do this in the utility room because I have a feeling this might stink. So we're about 4.5 hours into cooking, and the good thing is with not using this as a pressure cooker, so yeah, that steam vent is turned to the side, is we can actually have a look and see what's going on inside. I don't know what I expected to see there, but that's not inconsistent. I think it is going to need longer than 8 hours. Okay, we're at the end of the 8-hour slow cooker cycle now. I've moved this into the kitchen because actually it wasn't smelly after all. So there it is after that cooking cycle. I'm going to cook it again. Just going to have a little taste though first and see if this is working. This should taste a little bit like gravy. I mean, it does a little bit. It mostly tastes a bit fruity. So now I'm going to put it on a pressure cooker cycle. So we turn that valve round. We'll put it on the stock cycle, which is a pressure cooker cycle, and it runs for 1 hour. So that's going to happen next. We're at the end of that hour-long cycle now. Just waiting for the pressure to go. It's on pulse release, this pressure. That way it doesn't, if it foams up inside, it won't come squirting out of the vents. Okay, so there we go. That's after the pressure cooking phase. That is looking a bit more brown, you know, a little bit more reddish brown now. So I'm going to have a little taste and see what we've got now. Yeah, it tastes like there is a yeast extract flavour there. It's very faint. Now, it is possible that I should have cooked this lower, at a lower temperature for longer to allow enzymes to do the hydrolysis of the yeast, but I'm trying to follow the high temperature method, which is just to cook it and break it down that way. Anyway, I'll just strain that now, get the big lumps out of it. Well, it definitely looks like a change has taken place. That's encouraging. Okay, this stuff cooled down and has been in the fridge overnight, and it has settled into more or less 2 layers. There's a sludgy stuff down the bottom, and there's a comparatively clearer layer at the top. I'm just going to perform a couple of small experiments with this before we go any further, because I'm not quite sure that I've hydrolyzed the yeast enough. In some versions of the process, it's just the clear filtered liquid that we would reduce down to make our yeast extract. In others, it's the whole stuff. So that's one thing I want to test here, but I also just want to test that we have actually hydrolyzed the yeast enough. If not, we can do some more work on that. Using my basting pipette, I'm just going to take a little sample from the top and then from the bottom of that jug and reduce them in here. So that is a little sample of the top material. I'm just going to try and manage that into one blob so it doesn't just reduce to a thin film. Okay, that's nearly dry now and it's very clear. And somehow I doubt we've made transparent Marmite. Right, that's dry completely and there's just almost no residue there. So it's not really even enough to taste. It does taste slightly Marmitey. Now it's proving troublesome to get off the pan. So I will just have to very gingerly with a steel knife just gather that up. Yeah, I know metal utensil on non-stick. I know people don't like that, but here's the thing, it's my pan. Let's give that a taste. Well, it's crunchy. It does taste vaguely yeast extracty, not particularly strong, and quite sour. I imagine that's the acidity of the apple juice. Right, we will just get this back on, and I'll get now a sample from the bottom. I'm going to go into the same place. Spatula has been washed, if that matters at all. Wow, that dried quickly. Okay. Let's just wet the spatula with the mixture and try and gather that up. This is the peril, this is the problem of trying to reduce a very small amount of anything, I suppose. Okay, we got enough for a taste there. So that's the reduced sediment. That's more sticky. I've just dropped a bit on the ring, that's not going to help. Okay, well, let's give that a taste. Yeah, it's pretty good. So that doesn't quite taste like Marmite, but I think the reason for that might be just because this doesn't have any malt residue in it. So this is just yeast from fermenting apple juice, so it doesn't have all of those malty, roasted, hoppy flavours in it. So what we got is a very pure yeast extract flavour. I'm not completely convinced that that yeast is sufficiently hydrolyzed. I may run this through the pressure cooker one more time. So yeah, I'm definitely going to run this through one more time. All of it, including all of that sludgy bit at the bottom. I'll add a little bit more liquid, partly so you don't waste anything in there, but also this pressure cooker has a kind of minimum load, otherwise it could boil dry. I'm going to put that on pressure cooking for an hour and a half. There are three sort of broad categories of ways you can hydrolyze yeast to make yeast extract like this. The first one is chemical processes. So you can add an acid, like hydrochloric acid, to break down the yeast cells and, you know, dismantle the yeast cells, get those amino acids out, and then neutralize that acid with, say, sodium carbonate, releasing carbon dioxide gas, a bit of water, and the chlorine combines with the sodium to make salt. Or you can do the long, slow, low cook. So you can kind of sous vide it for hours, and the enzymes will break down the yeast. They basically decompose if you keep it below 50 degrees. We didn't do that, so those enzymes are probably destroyed now. The other way is just to cook and cook and cook, which is what we're doing. That's going to go on for an hour and a half, and then I'm going to stop messing around. We'll reduce that down and see what we end up with. Okay, second pressure cooking is done. And this has been standing while I went out, actually, so it's had a moment to stand. Let's just have another little taste. Definitely improved. Right, I'm going to stop this cooking here and we're going to do the reduction now. Yeah, I would say that's darker in colour than it was previously, so hopefully that's a good sign. So now, heat on. We'll start hot and we'll reduce the heat once it's boiling. But the idea is now we're going to reduce this down to concentrate it until we get down to some kind of sticky paste or syrup. That's boiling away. I will stir it once in a while just to make sure nothing's sticking on the bottom of the pan. All of this steam you see coming off of here is water leaving this mixture, so it's going to reduce down in volume. We're now down to about just over half the original volume. No noticeable change in viscosity at the moment. It's interesting how thin this all looks, actually, considering how much yeast I thought I had. But then that might well indicate that we have broken down the physical structure of those yeast cells and turned them into smaller things that are a bit more soluble. We're now down to 1/3 or so of the original volume, and there has been an abrupt change, not in the consistency, but in the bubbles. So it's now foaming, and I had to turn it down because it looked like it was going to boil right over. We're down to less than 1/4 of the original volume now, and I just happened to scrape the side of the pan where some had bubbled up and condensed a little bit more. And so here we've got something similar to what might be the end result. Let's have a little taste. It's definitely yeast extract. It's not very salty. Now, I did add an extra teaspoon of salt just before the pressure cooker phase. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. However, I think this probably could do with just another half a teaspoon of salt now. It's starting to get to the point where it might start to set and caramelize now, so I'm going to turn the heat down. And we're going to have about half a teaspoonful of salt in there. And now I must turn the extractor back on. It's been about 45 minutes in total, and it's really getting quite soupy now. So sometimes when I draw the spatula across the pan, you can actually see the bottom of the pan briefly. So it's getting quite thick and gloopy now. I still don't think we're quite at the point. I think we're there because it's congealing on the base of the pan now, and the texture is a lot like melted chocolate. I think it's time to stop. And I have got an empty yeast extract jar that I saved in anticipation of this project. However, I'm not going to put it straight in there. I'll just empty it out into this dish. It looks like it's going to be the right consistency. Quiet. I'll get the rest of that in a minute. So the plan is I'm going to leave it in that dish to cool down completely, judge the consistency. If it needs a little bit more reduction, then I can do that before we put it in the bottle. If it actually turns out to set solid, I might add a little bit of water and boil it again just to dilute it down. There it is, and I think we might be actually at the set point because the pan was quite difficult to actually scrape clean. A little taste at this point then. Bear in mind that really doesn't look like Marmite or normal yeast extract. That looks a lot more like chocolate. It's quite sour. I suppose that is just the malic acid from the apples being concentrated right down. I wonder if I should have added some baking soda to neutralize that acid. That would have also formed probably salt as a byproduct. Actually, change of plan. Right, so I've put a little bit of water in the pan there just to loosen off what was in the bottom. I'm going to have this out of the bowl back into the pan, and I'm going to dilute it for a moment and put it back on the heat momentarily. So I have just undone some of that reduction, so we'll have to boil that again for a few minutes. But bicarbonate of soda, about half a teaspoonful, and that's going to get mixed in. And I should think that will fizz up. Yeah, I can see it foaming, so it's reacting with the acid in here, neutralizing some of that acid. So we've actually got look, it's yeast extract mousse. Okay, don't worry about that. That will subside. I said I wasn't going to do chemistry, didn't I? Right, a little taste now, just to judge that acidity. I suppose I could get the pH test strips out, but I really did say I wasn't going to do chemistry. Much better. It's still quite sharp, but not like it was. And in a moment, I'm counting on that foam to subside. We're back to that melted chocolate consistency. So I'm just going to let that cool in the pan this time, and then it's going to go straight in the jar. Here goes. It'd be nice if we got enough to fill the jar, but I'm not sure we have. I think that's all we're going to get out of there. Right, I'll let that cool before I put the lid on, just so we don't get any condensation.
There is the question of branding to think about. In part 1, I tentatively suggested this stuff might be called Cidermite, but that sounds a bit like an infestation. So we could call it Shrimpmite, but that sounds like something that probably should actually contain crustaceans. Now that I think about it, a shrimp paste flavoured yeast extract spread might be good, or if not good, interesting. Note to future self to try that. It does definitely need to be something mite, and that's a weird situation all of its own. Marmite, Vegemite, Promite. Why do they all have mite in the name? Well, it's because that might suffix took on a life of its own. Much like any kind of scandal in the media may be called something gate, the gate suffix there being derived from the name of the place where the Watergate scandal happened, the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Now every scandal is something gate. Similarly, Vegemite and Promite are something might because of an earlier product that was called Marmite, which in turn is named for a sort of French cooking pot called a Marmite, which is the thing depicted on the label of Marmite. There are, of course, other yeast extracts that don't use the mite suffix, but I feel like mine should. So anyway, how about apple mite? It is, after all, derived from apple juice. We brainstormed this a bit on the Discord server, and one of the suggestions was pommite. Pomme being the French name for apple, so this circles back to the French name origin for Marmite. I suppose pommite may also have tickled Australian lovers of Vegemite, since I'm an Englishman making this stuff. In the end, though, I decided it's going to be called atomite, which sounds a bit like a 1950s sci-fi substance, but that's not a drawback. So I made a label for it, spending quite a while considering what kind of background should be on there, then printed that off and immediately didn't like it, so I did it all over again and ended up with this, which is still far from perfect, but I'm not spending any more time on it because we need to get to the point where we taste this stuff.
Okay, well, here we go. Oh, by the way, I've got a butter dish now. Butter is at room temperature. Unfortunately, it's still quite a cold room here in the kitchen, but let's see how we get on with... That does spread better. I think a bit more butter might not hurt. Now, I could taste this on its own, but I've already done a lot of that. So this is tasting in context. So here we go. Well, it looks more like chocolate spread than Marmite. In fact, it reminds me a lot of that anchovy paste, that Gentleman's Relish that I reviewed on a episode of Weird Stuff in a Can. Anyway, here we go. Well, it's definitely in the right general area, flavour-wise. It's lacking any of the bitter flavours that you get in Marmite or other yeast extracts that are made from beer yeast. There's also none of the malty flavours, which I think, now that I've got to taste this, it's really brought home how big a deal those malty flavours are in beer yeast extracts. It's generally not as strongly flavoured as Marmite or the other things, and so I'm spreading this really thick here. I think there's probably less salt in here than there would be on a regular yeast extract. Let's try it really nice and thick like that. It's okay. We've definitely made yeast extract. It has those savoury umami flavours. It's, I think, probably compared to beer yeast extracts, it's just a little bit underwhelming. There is an ever so slight sweetness and fruitiness that I assume is some residual component of the apple juice. It's not bad. It's not outstanding, but it is yeast extract. It's not bad. This might, I suppose, be yeast extract for people who don't like Marmite. You can have a little bit with no atomite on it. Good girl. So there we go. That's my... I've ruined the label already. That's my homemade yeast extract. Part 3 of this series will be the racking and bottling and tasting of the cider. So there's still that to come. I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.